And on behalf of the 2006 Martin Luther King Planning Committee, I'd like to welcome you to our community panel, Legacies of Oppression. Before we begin, I would like to invite you to participate in our remaining events. I hope you all had a chance to hear our keynote speaker, Dr. Michael Eric Dyson. Dr. Dyson was challenging, thought-provoking, humorous, and honest. He reminded us to focus our energy on eliminating structural inequality rather than on those folks who are most vulnerable and occupying difficult positions within our society. Tomorrow evening, beginning at 7 p.m., we will be showing the film Crash at the Marriott Center for Dance. Immediately following the film, we will have a discussion moderated by both faculty and staff at the University of Utah. Sunday, January 15th at 3:30 p.m. on KUED Channel 7, we'll be showing Citizen King, which explores the last 5 years of Dr. King's life. Immediately following the film at 5:30 p.m., Civic Dialogue will be focusing on the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in Utah, with guests including Dr. Karen Johnson and Mr. Michael Stiles. On Monday, January 16th, please join us for the cultural event featuring Alita Adams. This event will begin at 6:30 p.m. at Kingsbury Hall. Tickets are free, but I understand are very limited at this time, but can be picked up at the ticket office of Kingsbury Hall. Immediately preceding Alita Adams' performance, we will be honoring the 2006 Martin Luther King Leadership Award winners. And finally, on Tuesday, January 17th, please join us for the Forum Theater at 7 p.m. right here in this building again, in this space. Actors from the theater program, as well as audience members, will be invited to participate in an exploration of Crash. Back to the panel. I am honored to introduce our panel moderator, Professor Marianne Villarreal. Marianne is an assistant professor of history and ethnic studies. She received her bachelor's degree from Mount Holyoke College in women's studies and her PhD from Arizona State University. Her research has focused on Mexican-American family, women-owned, and women-owned businesses from 1930 to 1960. I've had the opportunity of working with Dr. Villarreal as a member of our Utah Opportunity Scholarship Committee, as well as with her efforts to assist local libraries in meeting the needs of the communities they serve. And I am impressed with her commitment to social justice and education. I am thrilled that she's been willing to accept the position of moderator for this important panel, and I now turn the time over to her to introduce the rest of our esteemed faculty panelists.
Thank you, Christy. And I want to thank you all for being here this afternoon. It is so wonderful to see this room full. And it is a great privilege to be sitting at this table with colleagues at the University of Utah. I'd like to introduce to you, in the order in which they'll be speaking this afternoon, with a few opening remarks, and then we'll move to questions. And first, opening will be Dr. Brian Brayboy. He's an assistant professor of education, culture, and society with a joint appointment in ethnic studies. Professor Brayboy received his bachelor's degree from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in the field of anthropology of education. His research is focused on American Indians in higher education and the experiences of students, staff, and faculty of color in higher education. He is the principal investigator of the American Indian Teacher Training Program at the University of Utah. And I kind of assumed that you knew that was him. So I made my own assumptions. At the end of the table, we have Dr. Dolores Delgado Bernal. She's an assistant professor of education, culture, and society, as well as ethnic studies. She received her PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles in education. Her research and teaching draw from critical race theory, Latino-Latina critical theory, and Chicana and other U.S. third world feminist theories to examine and improve the educational experiences of students of color. And next to me is Erica George, an assistant professor of law at the University of Utah's S.J. Quinney College of Law. She received her bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Chicago and her JD from Harvard Law School. Her research has included women's rights, children's rights and rights to education. She has also monitored human rights abuses against academics in various countries and addressed the World Education for All Forum convened by United Nations in Dakar, Senegal, on human rights abuses against children. Please help me in welcoming them this afternoon. And I thank you again, and I'll turn the time over to Dr. Greenaway.
Thank you all for coming. I'm really humbled to be here with Professors George Delgado Bernal, Villarreal. And before I start, I really want to thank Associate Vice President Karen Dace and Leo Leckie for organizing the week, and Christy Rugen, who's the chair of the organizing committee for the week. It really is an incredible lineup, and I'm humbled to be here. So I have the enviable task of talking about American Indian mascots in terms of structural and institutional racism at an institution that has an American Indian mascot, or as I've been corrected, an American Indian symbol. I take institutional racism to exist when institutions or organizations, including educational ones, have standard operating procedures, either intended or unintended, that hurt members of one or more races in relation to members of the dominant race. Institutional racism also exists when institutional organizational cultures, rules, habits, or symbols have the same racially biasing effect. And while our panel is really tied to institutional racism, I'm going to talk about this in the way that Joyce King talks about disconscious racism, which is a form of racism that exists when a procedure or act or symbol or mascot becomes normalized. We cease to think of it as anything other than normal. American Indian mascots or symbols, Shakespeare reminds me that a rose by any other name is still a rose, have become so commonplace that many members of society, and this really crosses racial boundaries, fail to see the offensive nature of these symbols. I'm going to just stop for a second, and if you all weren't at Professor Dyson's talk yesterday, it was incredibly powerful and moving. I was struck at one point when he talked and he said something along the lines of, if you can't become a Ute, maybe you should go to Penn. And so even for people who talk about themselves as progressive scholars, there's a disconnect here between sort of that work and then the ways we talk about individuals in a multiracial audience going to a keynote address. So all of us, many of us, have lost sight of the fact that we use symbols or mascots in ways that ignore the negative psychological and societal effects of their use. It has become normal, after all, to drive Cherokees, Dakotas, and Pontiac Aztecs. Congressional and military leaders who cheer for the Washington Redskins mourn the loss of a Black Hawk, Kiowa, or Apache helicopter while they eat chocolate chip cookies made with the butter that comes in a package with a beautiful Indian princess on it. And yet, they rarely are concerned with the economic state of the Apache or the Kiowa tribal nations. We're numb in myriad ways to the fact that American Indians are represented in society. And in urge to get away from it all, I'm torn between hopping in my Plymouth Sundance to attend a meditation retreat or to cruise to a faraway place in my Winnebago RV for a little R&R. In large part, the issues associated with mascots or symbols or imagery deals with the ways that we, as an indigenous people, are made visible and who gets to decide how we're made visible. I believe that these representations created by others are particularly problematic and would ask that we really move to have representations that we create and reflect the wide diversity of indigenous people who are viable, present-day members of society and not remnants of the past. How do we make space, for example, for an American Indian in a bow tie rather than a bolo? Open up spaces for indigenous people who drive minivans and take their children to preschool rather than envisioning them as people stuck in the past in old chitties. Not that there's anything wrong with a chitty. And if you all don't know what it is, it's an old sort of reservation car or truck that people drive around. They often refer to them as their chitties. With children in cradle boards, there must be room for American Indians to represent ourselves and for larger society to envision us as real, vibrant, viable people who are functioning members of society. We are, after all, complicated and nuanced people like everyone else. So I'm going to talk just quickly about a number of issues that I have with American Indian mascots as they relate to issues of institutional and disconscious racism, and some very specific concerns about what's happening with this fine institution that employs me. On August 21st, 2005, the American Psychological Association issued a statement backed by scientifically based research pointing out that the use of mascots, symbols, or imagery used in American Indians is problematic on a number of levels. For example, the use of these symbols and imagery establishes an unwelcome and hostile environment. Their use undermines the educational experiences of members of all communities. The images appear to negatively affect the self-esteem of American Indian children. Their use undermines the ability of American Indian nations to accurately portray respectful images of their culture. And they may in fact be disrespectful to religious and spiritual beliefs and values of many of our nations. They perpetuate stereotypes of American Indians, and they may in fact have detrimental mental health aspects to American Indian children and young adults. All of these concerns are backed, as I said, by scientifically research. I've heard lots of people say, we're honoring you. It's an issue of honoring, and yet I have a hard time thinking about how I talk to my departed ancestors or my recently departed mother about how the use of these mascots and symbols would honor her. How is it that I talk to my two American Indian sons, aged 2 and 4, about what these symbols do for them and how it's educational for them about who they are and who their daddy is? According to our website, the University of Utah's website, and I'm quoting here, the mission of the University of Utah is to educate the individual and to discover, refine, and disseminate knowledge. As a major teaching and research university, the flagship institution of the Utah State system of higher education, the University of Utah strives to create an academic environment where the highest standards of scholarship and professional practice are observed and where responsibilities to students are conscientiously met, end quote. I wonder if we as an institution are doing this when our students and community in which we're embedded attend football and basketball games dressed in war paint with feathers in their hair. What do we do with individuals who proclaim themselves to be Utes when they are not members of the tribal nation who are Ute? This disconscious racism that allows individuals to claim names as an affiliation for me is striking. And I've been particularly struck with the arguments that raged during this appeal with the institution and the NCAA regarding the Ute name. Lots of people said it's what the tribe wants. There are, of course, more than one Ute tribal nation, although the university only corresponded with the Northern Utes. The White Mesa Utes and Southern Utes were not contacted regarding their use of names for the purposes of the university. And what are we to make of the fact that there are 183 American Indians at this institution, and 4 of them are Utes? How do we make sense of the fact that the medical school, which is currently celebrating its 100th anniversary, has never graduated a Ute student? How do we make sense of the fact that the law school, which was founded in 1913, has not had a Ute graduate from it? Although they are quick to remind me that there is a Ute student in the second year class. The structural policies in place appear to exclude members of the Ute tribal nations from enrolling as students, certainly not for serving as symbols. Returning to the mantra around the use of the mascot, it's what the tribe wants, I am impelled to ask, would the community, I mean the broader community, be equally open to offering an open-door policy to the Northern Utes if they wanted to store nuclear waste on their tribal lands? How about if the tribal nation exercised its rights to water, thereby channeling the use of much of the water that the state of Utah relies on for our daily existence for the tribe's own economic interest? If you all haven't seen the Tribune today, above the fold, there's a story about $700 million needed to protect Utah's water. Technically, under constitutional law, that water largely belongs to the Utes. It's what they want. Somehow doesn't seem to go very far. We must be mindful that as a society we're willing to use this argument, it's what the tribe wants, when it serves our own purposes. As an institution, I think we're bound to examine our policies that limit the participation of Utes as students. I'm largely out of time, but I just want to talk about 2 quick things about the way these symbols work. They really remove the ability for us to say to us, to say to society, here's what we look like, here's who we are, not just at this institution or in this city or in this state, but nationally. And it's really, the other piece I think that plays out in terms of thinking about this more broadly is that it's not uncommon for the American Indian students at the University of Wyoming, who, as you all probably know, are the cowboys, to be bombarded with images of cowboys scalping or lynching a Ute, which is really a generic version of an American Indian, during the week that our football team plays their team. And returning closer to home, I had the fortuitous luck today to look at the Chrony, which I think is a wonderful newspaper, and it reminded me in looking at it today that we still have a long way to go. In discussing the story about the women's basketball team's victory last night over the San Diego State, whose mascot is the Aztec, their basketball team, the headline reads, "Massacre on the Mesa. You women trample the Aztecs." We have lots of work still to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to take a moment to, even though the name of the panel is Legacies of Oppression, I want to take a moment to actually look historically at oppression in relation to immigration. I've been asked to talk about immigration issues today. I think it's important to understand that the current anti-immigration policies and anti-immigrant attitudes can't be understood without looking at the historical pattern of immigration laws in this country. When it comes to issues of immigration, particularly immigration from Mexico and other Spanish-speaking countries, there is a clear relationship between the U.S. economy and how policies are adopted and implemented. In other words, at every economic downturn, recession, or depression in U.S. history, immigration laws and policies have become stricter and tighter. And quite honestly, in my opinion, more racist and mean-spirited. However, when the economy is good and there's a need for cheap immigrant labor, immigration policies are loosened or ignored altogether. And what I'd like to do is just give you some highlights or kind of a timeline starting with the beginning of the last century. And before I do that, I do want to say something that I know a lot of students don't realize when I talk about immigration in one of my classes, is that immigration policy first is federally mandated. States can't rule on immigration. The second thing is that immigration policy changes from country to country. So when I said specifically I'm looking at Mexico and other Spanish-speaking countries, immigration policy is much different for those countries than it is, say, for Canada or for immigrants coming from France, from Great Britain. And it is the policies that focus on these Latin American countries that I'm looking at. So starting with a timeline, 1914 to 1918, we have World War I. We need more labor because most young, able-bodied men are away, and so our immigration policies are relaxed. Then 1929, stock market crash. During the Great Depression, there's widespread unemployment, so you have not just stricter immigration policies, but actual government-sponsored immigration raids and deportations of Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Americans born in this country are deported to a country they've never been to before. And during these vicious roundups that took place in both public spaces as well as in private homes, going into private homes and taking people, putting them on trains to send them back to Mexico, about at least 600,000 Mexican citizens and U.S. citizens are deported to Mexico. 1939 to 1945, we have World War II. So once again, there's a need for more labor, and so immigration policies were loosened or ignored altogether. The Presero program was an agreement between the U.S. and Mexico governments that allowed the U.S. to recruit and essentially exploit workers, especially those workers that were doing field work, farm work in the agricultural industry. If I jump ahead to 1994, when the country's in a recession, we have the passage of Proposition 187 in California, which is kind of the beginning of the contemporary anti-immigrant conservative backlash. Immigrants are specifically targeted as the cause of California's economic problems. So you have a huge media blitz at this time, right before the election in November, that is pointing to immigrants as the problem for the schools, for social services, not having enough money in the public healthcare system, all those kind of things. And basically what Proposition 187 did was that it excluded undocumented immigrants from public social services, publicly funded health care, elementary, secondary, and post-secondary education. So in other words, somebody is in an emergency situation, they can't go to an emergency room if they are undocumented. A woman is pregnant and needs to go to a hospital to deliver, undocumented can't go. Kindergartners, first graders, second graders, if you're undocumented, you can no longer enter into the school. This passes in 1994 in California. What actually happened is it was 4 years in the court and was found unconstitutional. Again, as I mentioned, states can't set immigration policy. It was found unconstitutional. But what's important here is, even though it was found unconstitutional, from the day it passed, it set up a climate, a hostile climate to individuals who could be suspect of being undocumented. So the very next day, elections on a Tuesday, that next Wednesday, thousands of kids did not go to school. Parents were afraid what would happen to them and whether or not they would be taken away from their family or their family deported, what might happen. And so even though the law itself is found unconstitutional, what it created in terms of a hostile climate, the damage was done way before the court found it unconstitutional. Coming up to the present, a couple of years ago, a Salt Lake Tribune article quoted saying, immigrant workers in Utah face a double standard, wooed for the hard jobs when needed and scapegoated when it's convenient. That quote is actually connecting our local practices here in Utah with this historical pattern I just outlined. When we want someone to work in the mines or the turkey farms in southern Utah, when we want someone to clean our houses, offices, or hotel rooms, cut our grass, bus our tables, etc., we look to immigrant labor. Yet these same hardworking individuals are targeted with racist legislation that either deny their children access to education, which I'd like to talk about when we come to questions in a little bit, and the right to have a driver's license or the right to speak their native language. And so I think in terms of legacies of oppression and what's happening today, both in the nation, but particularly where we're at in Utah, we can only understand anti-immigrant sentiments and policies that are being put forth in the legislature as part of this, as a historical legacy, as part of this historical picture.
In keeping with the other panelists, I'd first like to thank Vice President Dace for organizing this wonderful event and to address our topic on legacies of oppression. I'm going to be speaking about the race to execute, and by that I'm thinking about race and the use of it in the application of the death penalty in this country. We've been asked today to address 4 questions, basically how structural racism relates to our topic, what policies in the last 3 to 5 years have impacted people of color the most in our selected area, and how the current political climate reinforces structural or institutional racism in the system that we're speaking about, and then finally to offer reflections for change. So I'm going to try to do all of that in the short time that I have, and I'll be starting in the past. So I'll talk about yesterday, and I'd like to talk about the history of lynching in America, and then I will talk about the present state of the death penalty in this country, and then I'll reflect on so what. If we discover that there are high error rates, what are the implications of that? And then now what? What are the kinds of things we can think about for solutions? So I'd like to first share a few empirical studies that have been done recently from 2000 to 2002 and most recently last year on how the death penalty is applied, and then some interesting historical facts on where most of the lynchings in America took place. So disproportion and distortion. Professor Liebman at Columbia University's Law School has found an empirical study that the capital error rate in sentencing in 2002 was 68%. which I think is astounding. More than 2 out of every 3 death sentences are eventually overturned due to serious procedural error. States that use the death penalty, these are states where we have a 68% error rate, are those states where higher proportions of the population are African American. So in addition to the issues regarding who should be eligible for execution, who makes that decision, and how to guarantee that there's accuracy and that we avoid error, there's a fundamental issue regarding the role that race has played in America and in our judicial system. It becomes most pronounced in our criminal justice system, I'll suggest. So I'm going to discuss the impact of the death penalty on Black defendants, Black victims, and Black communities. And I'd ask you to think more broadly about how that affects us as a community in America. So in keeping with my assignment, I'm going to note the connection between our current system of capital punishment and extrajudicial killings, a form of early domestic terrorism that's often overlooked in the Jim Crow South. So the racially disproportionate application of the death penalty can be seen as acting in historical continuity with the long and dark history of lynching in this country. It's also notable that the death belt, this is a term used by death penalty abolitionists, are 9 states: Texas, Florida, Louisiana, Georgia, Virginia, Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina, and South Carolina. These are southern states that account for over 90% of the executions carried out since 1976. They overlap considerably with the same southern states that have the highest incidence of extrajudicial, well, lynching, as I call extrajudicial killings, during the Jim Crow era between 1900 and 1929. These are the same 9 states plus 4 more: Arkansas, Kentucky, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Tennessee. The Tuskegee Institute estimates that about 5,000 lynchings took place between 1882 and 1968. So this isn't past history. In fact, we could argue that it's present. The last lynching that received a lot of publicity and acclaim occurred in Texas in 1998. You may have read about a Black man who was dragged behind a pickup truck until he was decapitated. Charles Ogletree of Harvard Law School has done another study, The Black Man's Burden, and he argues that this similarity between the Jim Crow South, the 9 states in the death belt, plus the 4 more, appears to be more than mere coincidence or correlation. He suggests that some of the factors that motivated lynchings may motivate our impetus to execute, hence the race to execute people of color in this country. Motivations for lynching, sociologists and psychologists have noted that it seems to be connected to an expression of racism and discrimination that's intended to enforce a caste system, to keep people in their place. So the analogy with domestic terrorism would be lynching one Black person would be enough to scare the rest of the community into submission with the social norm existing at that time in these states. Today, moving on to the death penalty. Race has historically played a role in the ability of Black defendants under the Constitution to have a fair and impartial trial. I'll leave my remarks on jury selection to the question and answer period, but I'd like to suggest that rather than talking about the 3 to 5 year things that may have been policies that affected the problem that we have, there's a 30 to 50 year history of exclusion of people of color from juries. As late as the 1980s, early 90s, prosecutorial training manuals that were given to new lawyers entering prosecuting offices advised them specifically not to have people of color on their jury, no matter how rich or how educated. I've never served on a jury. I'd just be interested in an informal poll on who has and who hasn't. In any event, the current state of the death penalty in this country, according to 2000 census data, Black and Hispanics make up 62% of the incarcerated population, though comprising only 25% of our national population. In 12 states, between 10 to 15% of the Black male population is in prison, state custody, and in some states, Hispanic youth are incarcerated at a 7 to 17 times the rate of white youths, and Blacks are 12 to 15 times the rate of white youths in prison. Mark Maurer, another social scientist, in his recent book, The Race to Incarcerate, has estimated, based on these statistics from 2000, if we continue in this way, 29% of the Black males born in 1991 will be in prison at some point in their life. Okay. What's the legal system doing about this? McCluskey versus Kemp is a Supreme Court decision that's finally confronted the issue of race and capital sentencing head on. and it does use empirical social science research, a study by Professor Waldes. He's done a seminal study on race disparity in criminal sentencing and did find that there was a disparity. In fact, defendants charged with killing white victims are 4.3 times more likely to receive a death sentence than someone charged with killing a black. So I said I was going to talk about black defendants, now I'll talk about black victims. You don't want to be a black victim. I mean, nobody wants to be a victim, right? But your killer will not receive the death penalty to the same proportional likelihood that someone killing someone of the white race would. So what? So what do we make of these facts? One, black defendants are judged more harshly than white defendants. Two, there's a racial imbalance in how sentences are handed down, which has implications for how we value black life more generally. As the system has played out, it would be easy to derive a sentiment that black lives are less valuable than whites. They're treated less seriously by juries in the criminal sentencing phase. And then three, there's a systemic disregard for black individuals and communities and how people are participating in this process or not participating in the process. So racial differences can occur at every stage in the criminal proceeding, from arrest to prosecution to jury selection and ultimately the final sentence that's handed down. And if it's not a death sentence, there's also racial disparity in parole, assuming this is a crime that is eligible for parole. So the current system of capital punishment, I would suggest that Professor Ogletree may be onto something in thinking that there is some historical continual link with our past and whose lives are valued and whose are not. Is that something that we want to reinforce in our criminal justice system? I'd suggest not. So now what, if that's the so what? It's difficult to move beyond this as more than understanding as something that's inevitable and eradicable and something that would be in our legal system if it is in our legal society. How can we eradicate it? I think that we have to overcome our aversion to discussing race, not merely reaching conclusions and identifying problems, but even seeking information about race and where problems might still exist. So I'll end my remarks there, but hope to have this conversation and question and answer.
I haven't taken this many notes in a while, so thank you very much. As I'm going to open it up to question and answer, and I want to make a couple of remarks before I do the Q&A. One, I was asked to speak on issues regarding gays and lesbians and how they're affected in terms of oppression. And I'm going to put two things on the table. I'm not going to say very much as moderator. I want to move on to these other questions. But one of the things that that we certainly need to think about is how the whole controversy over marriage, in our own backyard with Amendment 3, how that has really sent us on a chase of equality that really ignores some of the real, the harder issues within gay and lesbian communities for us to talk about. And I think it was raised by the panelists, is how do we talk about this? One, how do we talk about it when we're misinformed by our media with bits of information? And two, how do we begin to engage in conversations about race when it just seems to always be such a difficult topic for people to still want to talk about? We can talk about it as in our historical past. We can believe that lynching is something that is long gone. However, when we live in a state that has had 18 years of trying to pass a hate crimes bill, that says something about our resistance to talking about what race does, the ways in which we allow this racism to perpetuate itself. And then the second thing that I want to add to the topic of gay and lesbian issues is that what we also seem to ignore in that is how immigrants are affected by this, and the ways that immigrants are at the hands of law and policy left then to fend for themselves as non-citizens, and particularly because they're gay or lesbian, in the ways that they're criminalized in this policy. And so I want to put that on the table, and yes, it's not too much information, but I hope it sits somewhere on your radar for you to think about. So given that I want to thank you because we've talk to what I hear the panelists talking about are the ways that, one of the things that I did ask them is, what can we as a community, how do we respond to all of these areas? And I think that is floating out there somewhere. I'm going to come to you with questions, and then hopefully we can start to have this conversation about how do we respond to this? How do we act as a community to these legacies, right? To the ways in which they still manifest themselves in our daily beings, in our campus environment, in our state legislature, in our national politics. So with that, I don't know if there's a mic out there. If I'm to run around with the mic, I can do that. Yes, ma'am.
I just have one question. I would like to get to one of the people around, Professor of Law. Okay. And your name is again?
Oh, Professor George, Erica George. Hi.
Is racism and oppression used to form law in society to maintain order?
That is an excellent question. The question was, is law used to maintain racism or?
Is racism and oppression used to form law in society to maintain order?
Yeah, so rather than how we traditionally think about law as having civil rights and civil liberties, is it a tool that's used to promote racism, or vice versa, race is used to, the question is about the role of race in law and whether racism is promoted through law. Is that accurate?
Is racism and oppression used?
Is racism and oppression used
To form a law.
to maintain order? Gosh, yes, in some instances, right? There are many ways in which race bias can come into the judicial system. In the historical past, it was codified. It was law that you would treat people differently, and our highest courts said that. Multiple legislatures in the South also said that. Law has done a lot of violence to, I think, the communities that Dolores is concerned about. It doesn't have to be that way. The law of society is not the law of gravity, right? These are things that can be changed. So I think it can be an instrumental tool in the right hands, and those hands are ours. We're a democracy. So to the extent that we can become better informed about how race and racism and structural oppression impact us wholly, broadly as a community, not just the Black community, a Native American community, an immigrant community, will be further along towards a truer democracy, I think.
Can I also respond to that?
Yes.
Like Marianne said, we can think about it in the past, but what are the legacies? So I actually want to take a minute to address this question and the racist attacks that are on immigrant children that are currently being proposed in our state legislature today in Utah. These attacks focus on repealing a law, HB 144, that passed in 2002. The law allows undocumented students who have lived in Utah for 3 years and graduated from a Utah high school to pay in-state, to be in-state residents, to pay in-state tuition at universities. It also requires undocumented students to sign an affidavit that says they'll apply to adjust their status and eligible. But there's a lot of myths and misconceptions about this law that I'd like to point to. One is it's been called, it's a freebie that the state gives to undocumented immigrants. Not true. Immigrants, whether documented or not, pay taxes. They pay state taxes, federal taxes, sales taxes, and property taxes, whether they own or rent. And so they are contributing to institutions of public education at the K-12 level and higher education. It gives an unfair advantage to immigrant students who are applying to college. Not true. This law has nothing to do with admission standards or admission requirements. Once a student has been admitted, it then allows them to pay in-state tuition since they have lived in the state for at least 3 years and graduated from Utah high school. And then some say it's unfair to those students who are U.S. citizens and pay out-of-state tuition here at the University of Utah or other state institutions. Not true. Whether or not the law is repealed, students, whether they're U.S. citizens or not, who have not met state residency requirements, in other words, someone coming from Idaho, Wyoming, California, will still have to pay out-of-state tuition. It doesn't matter whether or not this law is in place, they will still have to. In other words, there's no net gain or loss for students who currently pay out-of-state tuition. It encourages illegal immigration to the state of Utah. Not true. Most immigrants know nothing about this law before coming to this state, and indeed many immigrants living here don't even know that it currently exists. Immigrants are more often attracted to this state because we as a state hire them, because there is a demand for their labor, and very often because of their connection to the LDS Church. LDS Church certainly sends missionaries all throughout Latin America, and there's a lot of Latino immigrants that are converts. So to the question is, does racism frame law? Yes, the repeal that's currently being proposed targets children, many who came to this country with their parents as babies or as toddlers. If passed, it will negatively impact the children who are currently in our public schools. The children that my son go to school with, the children that your children play sports with, the children that go to your church, the children who are the future of this state and this nation. Representative Glenn Donaldson's HB 7, which would repeal the current law, it's called House Bill 7, is a racist law. And so yes, I think racism frames law today. It's economically flawed, it's morally flawed. His actions and those of HB 7 supporters parallel exactly what Dr. Michael Eric Dyson said yesterday. He talked about that in regards to Mr. Bill Cosby. He said it's an attack on displaced and vulnerable peoples in our society. Like Dr. Dyson said, it ain't a fair fight.
Respond to how racism also perpetuates our use of American Indian mascots, as all the ones that you mentioned, from vehicles to school mascots.
I think for me, the role of racism as it perpetuates these myths really gets played out in this form of disconscious racism, which I talked about earlier in my comments, which ends up being hidden, and for many of us who think about ourselves as progressive thinkers, continue to perpetuate anyway. And I think it's just largely become, the fact is that whether or not these portrayals of indigenous people are accurate or not, no one really seems to care anymore. It's largely become hidden from view. And so I think that even well-meaning, good-minded, wonderful people continue to engage in practices that there's scientific evidence proving hurts all of the children of society, and in particular has pretty hardcore influences on the self-esteem of American Indian children, who are already the lowest performing population in schools now. You begin to play that out and you think about what members of our society are going to grow up to be able to really have a voice. It's particularly troubling for me in those ways, I think.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to add a comment to Dr. about the Mouse assessment. And first of all, the confusion with non-resident and non-documented students needs to be delineated in that non-resident students from out of state, and after 60 credit hours, become a resident and pay resident tuition. Many of the undocumented students have been residents in the state of Utah for years, 10, 15, almost their whole life. The other thing I wanted to also point out is that House Bill 144, although in my view at the beginning, is definitely not enough, because these students who are citizens of this country and who are taxpayers and families are, they get in-state tuition, but they have no financial aid. So they pay a $1,500 semester plus books, so let's say $2,000 a semester. And what you see with these students is that this idea that they're getting something for nothing is completely erroneous, in that they have to pay the tuition themselves. They have to work. Many of the students do what I call leapfrog, where they work a semester enough to save for a semester, to pay for that semester themselves, and then have to take a semester off in order to work again to pay for the following semester. So in my view, ethically, these students, if we're going to educate the students of this state in an equitable way, they should also have access to financial aid if they're paying the taxes, which they are. And I just want to point that out to further delineate the idea that these students are getting something for nothing, and this erroneous comparison that the state is losing money because of this law is absolutely untrue. I just wanted to add that on to Dr. Pavel's assessment.
Thank you. Was there another hand for a question?
Can I
Yes.
just go ahead?
Yes, sir.
I just had a question, just quick. I guess it's also an observation. Just as legacies of oppression on different communities in the United States, I find it rather telling that there is not an Asian American representative on the panel, and how I think maybe that could also be a legacy of oppression of the Asian American people, that our voices are not heard or we're not recognized as a community of color.
That was an observation? Yeah. No, I could comment on that. I mean, I can't speak on behalf of the committee that put this panel together. I think, though, that I just can't speak on behalf of it. But what I'd like to say is that I think one of the areas, I mean, the conversations that we often have is, does diversity mean that we're going to fill every ethnic group and then we're there? How do we have these conversations? I unfortunately was unable to make Dyson's lecture yesterday, but the fact that we come together as a multi-ethnic, multinational group and speak in a voice about diversity in a much larger context rather than just as adding water, or adding people and stirring in with the water. So, I get to fill two voices today, brown and queer, so.
And I think it's an important observation, because I do think, my work focuses on Latinos and Latinas, on people of color generally, but my work really focuses there. And I know that very often Asian American voices are left out of the discussion because of this whole notion of the model minority. Somehow the oppression hasn't been the same or as severe. And that's very problematic. So I think the observation is an important one, and one that we should all give attention to in all of our work, not just this panel, but that when we're talking about different historically underrepresented ethnic racial groups, that this model minority myth is exactly that, not true. Again, it's a myth.
Just one last thing on that point. I teach constitutional law over at the law school, and what's interesting is there is, far from the model minority legacy here in Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, as you may well know, the internment camps were here. And there's a local judge in town who's been good enough to come to my class each year and speak about his experiences. So if you're interested, look up the website, email, and check my syllabus. It'll probably happen next month. So we'll talk about Korematsu, and we'll talk about how the law frames racial identities and how we look at race and the kind of scrutiny that we should have under the Constitution. So,
as chair of this committee, my fingerprints are all over the questions, the discussion, and the frame of this presentation. As an Asian American, I feel very connected to all of these entities, and while our faces are not represented on that panel, I believe as an Asian American, my voice is in each and every one of them. So I do understand that we need to see Asian Americans up there talking about them. I also think as people of color, we have to find places where we overlap and are committed to the same issues around social justice.
I'm going to pose one last question to the committee before we leave here this afternoon, and to the panel, and that is to perhaps give us some ideas about how we as a campus community can move forward, about conversations that we should be having at the dinner table and with our friends here in the union about how do we respond to racism at all levels as a community? Would you like to start, Dolores?
Sure. I think there are a number of very practical, pretty easy things that we can do that can make a difference. In relationship to immigration specifically, the Education Interim Committee has already passed a resolution that repealed HB 144. There may be a public hearing, so you need to watch the paper to see if that takes place. If there is a public hearing, it's important that we go, that we give our voices, particularly for those who are in the same vulnerable position as those that are undocumented, because coming forth for them is even more difficult. Being vulnerable and their status being exposed. I think most important in relationship to HB 144 is to write your senator. They need to hear from those of us in Utah. And in some ways, I always wonder in a talk like this, it's so nice, it's full. I think we're preaching to the choir that most of the people here are believe in the things that the panelists are saying. But that's not enough. We can't just believe it. We do have to take the next step that Marianne is pointing to, which is action. If you don't know who your senator is, you can go to utah.gov, click on the legislature, find out, and do a quick 2-paragraph letter saying what your thoughts are on this or other issues that are coming up in the legislature that are oppressing different groups and, again, the most vulnerable. I think in terms of educating, teach-ins, students can do that. Teach-ins in terms of some of these issues, in terms of what it would mean to repeal HB 144. And these can be formal, but I think the other thing that's real important is informally. Our families, our friends, and what something like repealing HB 144 means, or even in the language we use. Dr. Grayboy talked about this idea of it just becomes normal, the way we use certain language. The very small comment that Dr. Dyson said yesterday in an incredibly powerful, wonderful speech, because things become normal. Using the language of illegal alien, how hurtful, how damaging that is to individuals, particularly when you're talking about children. It sends a message that they're unlawful. They don't belong here. They're the other. And so educating ourselves and those that are the closest around us, friends and family, is really important. And I also believe that street politics is another strategy that we do have to continue to do. So whether it is demonstrations, protests, I think all these different angles, from the writing your senator to street politics, it is taking that next step of action, because my guess is most of you in the room believe in some way in the things that are being said, but it's that next step. It's putting the words into action.
I think there are a couple of things that seem to me to be fairly practical, but also probably harder than would like to imagine. And I really do take seriously our mission as a state institution to be good community members. I think President Young, in a commentary in the Salt Lake Tribune a few Sundays ago, really talked about the role of the institution in the state as the University of Utah, or Utah's university. I think he sort of turned it on its ear to begin to think about this. And our role isn't just within the bounds of this institution, but really sort of seeps out elsewhere for us to work at disseminating knowledge and forming partnerships with communities, underrepresented, marginalized communities. I think it's deeply important for people to listen to one another and begin to hear them and allow marginalized, underrepresented students to guide the conversation. This to me seems really to be a difficult issue, but we have to have allies who are standing beside us to help members from dominant society, white society, to be able to say, I hear that, and help them hear that. And importantly, I think it's important to be able to make mistakes, right? If you're going to engage in this work, you have to be able to make a mistake and come back to the table. I think when we become passive and we say, I can't do that, I made a mistake, we end up just sort of allowing the status quo to continue. So for me, a real practical thing is asking questions, listening, making mistakes and getting back up and coming to the table to begin to engage in these issues around House Bill 144, to think about what the issues are around the use of a mascot, to think about what it means, what diversity means on this campus. Diversity is not just our job, these people who look like us on the panel, but it's everyone's job. And I think this institution, part of the mission statement says we're committed to issues of diverse thought and diverse student bodies. And so the institution, everyone, not CESA, not the AVP for diversity, but every administrative unit and student unit on this campus is charged with creating an environment that is open to diverse issues and being willing to hear what people have to say, regardless of how comfortable it is.
Wow. After that, really all I have to say is me too. Inform yourselves. Again, I do think we're preaching to the choir, and act informed. Take action. And I think both the professors here have articulated in a very more articulate way than I will say that this isn't just a people of color issue. We are about becoming people of conscience, and the more and more of us that there are, the better I think our community as a whole, as this country will be. So, thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the panelists again for this afternoon. We are unfortunately out of time. I would like to also thank the MLK Committee and the Office of the Association, the Associate Vice President for Diversity. Thank you very much. And, I do encourage you to continue to support all these events. We're very, as much as higher education lags behind, we are an institution with people who are thinking consciously about how we have these conversations. So please take these conversations home.